everyone, I'm Carole Freeman of Hypnotic Nutrition. I'm the creator of the 90-Day Keto Diet Challenge. I'm here today with Randy Webb, that's Webb with 2 B's, and he's known as the Connector among many other things. So Randy, will you tell us who you are?
Sure. Well, I have a number of jobs. I do a number of things, Carole. I work full-time for an organization that is kind of like an HMO, has a contract with the state to kind of manage public behavioral health, and for a lot of folks managing their health eligibilities and health plans all together. And I work in the training function, the clinical training function there.
Oh, so you're a fantastic teacher, a dynamic teacher there.
And I also have a private practice. I see people who, on a sliding scale, folks who might not have eligibilities or health plans or any kind of insurance of any kind elsewhere. And I see them to provide all kinds of psychotherapeutic services.
Well, I'm so excited to be able to talk to you, though, because you're an amazingly generous person, a connector. You truly care about people on a deeply compassionate level, and everything you do is all about empowering. Like, Randy's excellent at seeing people's strengths and really outlining that for people, and just making them feel really, really good to be around. So
Thank you.
Your private practice, so mental health, in different states it has different names. In Seattle it's a licensed mental health counselor, and what do they call it here in Arizona?
A licensed professional counselor, and
Okay.
I've maintained my licensure in Washington with the idea of being in some form or another. I might do some work with folks in Washington State as well.
Okay. Well, you do traditional talk therapy, what EMDR,
Mm-hmm.
and hypnosis. So I want to talk about EMDR a lot. I want to talk about hypnosis a lot. But I also want to talk about the surprise that I had. I know you from 4 years ago. You were my supervisor at my mental health counseling internship up in Seattle area. And that was over 4 years ago. For a number of reasons, you left us there in Seattle and came back here to Phoenix. At that time, when I knew you last, you were vegetarian. When I came to visit, I didn't assume anything was different. However, I found out significant things had changed for you. So will you share with everyone what changes you've made and what inspired those changes?
It got to the point to where I started having a number of health problems come up. I was having difficulty keeping weight off. I was fatigued. I started having sleep trouble. I started having kidney difficulties. Started having more allergies. The psoriasis seemed to get worse.
You said some blood sugar was starting to get elevated too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like your triglycerides are really, they're getting pretty problematic now. And there I was thinking, well, I'm a vegetarian. You know, I'm eating very low-fat things, and staying away from saturated fats, especially being concerned with how my kidneys were doing. Now thinking, well, maybe I need to be really careful about how I'm doing with any kind of protein. I need to be really careful for that. Instead of things, it really alleviating things, they were getting worse. Okay, well, maybe if I bring more protein in, as I'm doing some of these other vegetables in, and of course my first impulse was to go more towards plant-based protein, and it really wasn't quite putting a dent in it. I'm thinking, what's going on?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we've got that high triglycerides or this high cholesterol because that's what Dad gave us. That came from our father. Now, we don't really know if that's true or not, but that became our narrative.
You graduated high school. Congratulations. Here's the high triglycerides.
Okay, that's great. Yeah.
Well, and you'd shared with me that it was a former landlord actually that started sharing information with you about perhaps carbohydrates playing a role in the health problems you were having. Is that kind of where the inspiration came to really shift things the other direction?
Absolutely, because there was a certain degree of accountability. I rented part of the house, and that meant that I was using her kitchen to prepare meals. So she's watching me making, for example, oatmeal, for example, or maybe dry cereal or something, or maybe drinking almond milk, or maybe drinking chocolate soy milk. And so she's seeing this, and she's going, Randy, you know, you're getting an awful lot of sugar there. Or maybe I'd have that with orange juice. And she's going, and she was very polite about it. I mean, she had been renting in her place for a long time, so she was very tactful, and she said, maybe you'd introduce some protein to that. Add some protein to that, at least balance it. Now, if I watched her eat, what is she eating for breakfast? Well, she's having, let's see, she's either having whitefish or she's having sardines, and that's what she's eating. You know, maybe she's eating some eggs with all of that.
Yeah.
And I'm going, whoa. And then I'm hearing her, she's now 82, longevity runs in the family. Yet at the same time, that's how her family ate.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm seeing her, and she's coming back from the doctor. Oh, the doctor's saying I'm doing really well, and my cholesterol is really low, and I'm doing really great. My blood sugar's great, and I have a lot of energy, and she sleeps great. And I'm going, that's not fair. And I just associate it with genetics. It's all she has longevity in the family. It's all genetics. Yeah, and I'm finding out now. It was kind of a transition.
Mm-hmm.
And then she said, and she could really be a hypnotherapist herself or hypnotist. She's going, I'd invite you to consider that maybe you ought to start moving some healthy fat. And of course, there's that whole healthy fat thing. So there was this more of, but then I'm seeing her eating things like bacon, and I'm seeing her eating things like, okay, well, she's roasting this leg of lamb or something, and she's having that with, and I'm going, hold a second, what's going on?
You said healthy fat.
Yeah, like, what? Yeah, I know she's eating avocados, and she's eating all kinds of things. She's eating lots of salmon and deep water fish and tuna, and she's doing those things. But she's also not having any ill effects of eating a whole lot of things that were forbidden for me. I thought.
Beginning of the end.
Very much so.
So how's your health changed then? Have you gently moved away from, reducing carbohydrates, introducing a little bit more fats and animal proteins?
Absolutely. And starting with reducing, just kind of moving from making use of what she was recommending of introducing fats, introducing proteins. I went through a phase where I was doing a lot of protein, and I was seeing a change, maybe by virtue of reducing sugar. Well, that was another piece of the thing, right? Reducing the carbohydrates, reducing sugar, reducing that, where in the intermediate steps it was adding some things. But as I reduced the carbohydrates, and I don't drink, so that wasn't much of an issue. And in my case, I found that probiotics was helping a bit.
Okay.
But going away from probiotics, where it was like, okay, well, eat this frozen yogurt, for example, or eat this yogurt, and it has a few probiotics, but not much, and it's loaded with sugar.
Mm-hmm.
So absolutely, yes. I guess the last frontier for me will be to reincorporate eggs, which I've been scared to death of.
Yes, you have about 6 of them in your fridge as a gift.
I'm going to be trying them. I'm going to eat them, and I've been away from them for so long that even the texture was kind of messing with me, even though what I would do sometimes is cheat and eat, like eggs and certain things like a burrito or something. I guess there is maybe a possibility that I can work those in and not really feel it. Yeah, it's kind of.
It's always interesting when a hypnotherapist has mental blocks to things.
Yeah, I definitely have had those, no question.
You've changed your diet.
Right.
How's your health?
Yeah, I have seen improvements. The triglyceride. In fact, the last time I had my blood checked, which was maybe 3 months ago.
Okay.
I came back and I was surprised. The doctor said, you're doing something right. Because I kind of incorporated these latest waves of changes with the main ingredient being really reducing the carbohydrates. But yeah, the report was very good. Triglycerides have dropped a bit. Cholesterol is getting really good. Overall blood sugar, the glucose levels are really looking a lot more favorable. And so just by doing nothing more, not really adding a lot more fat, protein remaining pretty stable, but just by simply reducing the carbohydrates. Just doing that one thing is making that much of a difference already.
Yeah. Well, and it's, we talk about this a lot on these keto chats, is the bio-individuality, and that for you may not ever have to go full ketosis. You may never have to restrict your carbohydrates that much. You might see a reversal of the blood sugar raise. Basically what you're describing is metabolic syndrome. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but expanding waistline, high triglycerides, high blood sugar, and then if you have one other component, which could be low HDL, the good cholesterol, if that was low, or high blood pressure, if you had one of those, then likely you were developing what's called metabolic syndrome, which reducing carbohydrates is one of the best ways of treating that. And so then, as we've talked about with other people, it's just about finding what's the perfect amount for your body. What can you tolerate? Where does your health maximize? And it sounds like you're on your way to figuring out what that is. So
I'm optimistic. I will say one of the big adjustments was being cautious about fruit intake. That was a really big adjustment for me, because I'd always associated with, the more fruit the better, and the juices are good for you, and the smoothies are good for you, and they would throw all kinds of, it has kale in it, it's got to be healthy, that's a superfood.
100 grams of sugar too. But
yeah, never mind, it has 100 grams of sugar in with it, but Yeah, that's been I would say another piece of the puzzle, and getting really strategic about that as well. And so this idea of being aware of how many grams of any kind of carbohydrate, including fiber, has been kind of some new learning for me. It's really helpful. Yeah, so I'm kind of excited. I'm kind of excited about where that's going to lead me.
Well, great. Well, hopefully you get to keep watching these keto chats and learn even more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm committed. I'm making the commitment here.
Yeah, well, that's the big surprise that I got coming down here. I had no idea before I came to visit. So, well, I appreciate you sharing all that about your personal information. And switching gears now, I'd love to talk about hypnosis and your involvement in that, how you even got involved in that in the first place. Here we are in Arizona, the home, is it the homeland of Milton Erickson? Okay.
It really is.
Well, tell us about that.
Absolutely. I would say, this may kind of strike you as funny, but when I was young, I was fascinated. I had this fascination with how we would see television programs about people experiencing all kinds of really weird and scary things, right? Ranging from maybe a violent crime of some kind, all the way to people reporting being abducted by extraterrestrials. I mean, all kinds of things. And invariably there'd be some program of a hypnotherapist involved, helping people recall, by way of regression, recalling something that happened earlier, right? That was fascinating to me, but I really didn't do much with it until I was taking some of those courses in behavioral health or in psychology, behavioral sciences, and I was taking an ethics class, and there was a person in the class who was really interested in hypnosis. So this was like 1992 or so. I'd already kind of left studying languages and linguistics formally, and I went, hey, you know what, I'm going to try some of this stuff. And it was by doing that I found out about Milton Erickson, who spent the last part of his life here in Phoenix. There are a lot of things. There's even a center, the international headquarters for the foundation is right here in Central Phoenix.
I didn't get to go visit that this time. Next time.
Next time we're gonna do that. And so that kind of started a whole process of getting trained and supervised by them. And so I was kind of still doing a lot of group work, but moving more into that. So that's how I kind of got started into Erickson's work and a lot of things that came out of Erickson's work, including his particular approach to clinical hypnosis. Oh yeah, it's wild. Yeah, Milton Erickson. A lot of people say Eric Erickson. Well, not the developmental psychologist, but Milton with a K, C-K in his name.
Yeah. Well, so what's interesting about his approach? Was he the first one that brought it in? Where does it even start?
I would say that what set Erickson apart was what's referred to. There are a couple things really stand out about Milton Erickson. One of them is definitely his idea about it being a permissive orientation, meaning that instead of trying to stick ideas into people, to really try to elicit their strengths and internal resources. So that was really something that we say sets him, at least at the part, the time he came along in the 1930s, really set him apart from how people had been doing hypnosis.
Okay. Do you mind if I challenge you right now and ask for an example of
Absolutely.
a phrase that would be an example of, a hypnotic phrase or something you would say to somebody in a hypnosis session that was...
Absolutely. So there are a lot of expressions attributed with Erickson. So one of those that kind of represents it, then I'll give you a concrete example of what that looks like in a session, would be if you give people a blank, they will...
So I'm compelled to finish the sentence, right? Yeah.
And that's kind of just a one of many examples of representative statements of an Ericksonian approach towards hypnotherapy. And
so, like leading them into... What?
Yeah. It worked for me too, right?
Yeah.
So, the idea that need that people have to complete, that kind of idea in Gestalt therapy of give people room to have their own experiences. So what that might look like in a session might be, Erickson might say, he might start with naming a number of things that are familiar to you, to where you're, and that way it's very much like other forms of influence in a way, with it being unlikely to help you think, feel, and behave in new ways if I start by creating a firm foundation of a recognition and acceptance of what's already true for you. So the idea for Erickson was I want to discover your values and motivations and things, your associations and things that matter to you before I go about the business of offering something new to you. So in a session I may say, like if we're trying to help a person get into this focus state. For Erickson, hypnosis is not necessarily just about relaxation. It's about focus.
So focused relaxation was what I was told when I was trained,
Yeah, and then
hypnosis is a state of focused relaxation.
And for us, for Ericksonians, it's Well, it may or may not be relaxing. That's one of the things it can do.
Mm.
It can also be about focus, you finding something that matters to you, regardless of where you're focused. So for Erickson, trance was a natural state. We talked about that with Jim the other day, is it's a natural state to go into trance. So Erickson might say in a session, he might say a number of things we call truisms. He might say, as you're there and I am here, you can begin to notice and consider some of the things you may have thought about recently, or perhaps some of the things you have felt about that you have started to notice. Your senses can start to tell you about what may be important to you. And I'm wondering when you'll start to think or feel or sense those things. It could be in any moment now, or it could be later, because you can be in charge of it. So some little snippet like that starts to give you an idea of, I'm interested in generating with you an environment where we, as Erickson would say, elicit those things from you, as opposed to me telling you, you're getting sleepy, sleepy, and you will, instead of you will think, feel, and or behave, you can. As you notice this, which you're likely to at least not consider untrue, as we notice certain things you're likely to consider as true for you, then you can begin to go and discover or observe and notice what matters to you. You may even notice the voice, right? Like, okay, he's done that a couple times. So.
I hope you're all feeling nice and relaxed. I anticipate that you are feeling relaxed now.
Yeah, and I'm wondering what that'll be like when you start to make the connections. I invite you to consider what might be a new way of thinking about that, or maybe feeling about it, or just sensing it. And you can just observe it, and that can be wonderful.
Yeah, it does feel good though. Anything else about hypnosis that perhaps some misconceptions that people have about it?
Oh yeah, in fact, there's a notion in Ericksonian approaches that has to do when folks first kind of start to get to know each other. They're starting to build a therapeutic relationship, and one of the ideas is a kind of a step, I guess, if you wanted to call it a step, called pre-hypnosis, where the idea is, what are some of your beliefs? To ask the person who's going to experience it, what are some of your beliefs about hypnosis? And oftentimes people do say, well, am I going to lose control? Are you going to take charge of me? Or are you going to have me do things I don't believe in doing? Or am my soul going to be open for something to come in and be hurtful to me? Do I need to trust you? Are you going to tell me what's wrong with me? Or are you going to try to... And so some of these notions, right, about trust and safety and control, and so, those things come up, or ideas about, is this like stage hypnosis? Is this for entertainment? Are you going to have me imitating an animal or something? I'm going to start barking like a dog or quacking like a duck because they'd seen things like that in entertainment on TV. And we say, well, that's not my intention here. My intention is always for your safety, for us to find out what matters to you. And I'll say things like, you'll hear, right? It's kind of an ethics in all forms of clinical hypnosis of, I'm not going to take you anywhere you don't value going. You are in charge. You're always in charge. And we're going about the business of discovering your strengths and discovering what matters to you. So I'm not going to take you anywhere you don't want to go.
Great, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what kind of clients do you see? What kind of common issues do you find a lot of your patients have?
I would say in my private practice, most of the folks I see are folks who've gone through an awful lot of suffering. So very difficult relationships with their primary caregivers. Oftentimes their biological families. They go through a lot of scary things growing up. Most of us do.
And by primary care, you mean like their parents, not like their main doctor.
Oh, right. Like the primary, the primary system of support. A little psychobabble there for you. So. The folks you more than likely who had the most influence in bringing you up in the world.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, and so those are the most common things. Oftentimes I see people who have gone through things like, sexual assault, or they've witnessed violence, or maybe they've been robbed, or they've come back from working as police officers and other first responders. Those folks go through a lot of scary events, right? And so with those folks, I would say most of those folks, sometimes I see folks who may be foster parents or folks who have other folks in their home. And maybe they're considering adopting or they have foster children, and sometimes they get overwhelmed sometimes with what those children and youth are facing themselves, you know.
So it sounds like kind of a common thread is like a lot of trauma.
Typically.
Probably significant trauma then.
Very much so.
How do you see then that manifests in people's lives? So obviously this trauma's affected them on some level. How is that coming forth in their everyday lives? How's it affecting them?
It shows up in a lot of different ways. It can show up in physical pain. It can show up as tremendous anxiety, difficulty sleeping, and academic difficulties or work difficulties. The one that's really interesting for me, since most of the work I do as a clinical trainer has to do with integrated care, so oftentimes we're interfacing, collaborating, training with people from other fields, education, child welfare, and more with medical professionals, right? Nurses and physicians of many kinds. And one of the things that comes up frequently is how, when people kind of go through these experiences, how do they take care of themselves? You know, are they getting enough rest? Are they getting enough an opportunity to take good care of themselves? And not ironically, right, it shows up in their diets too, and how they eat. Oftentimes, just going for something fast, not being very mindful about how they fuel themselves, and so that becomes a big factor too. It becomes one of the pieces of the puzzle.
Now there's a concept we've talked about a few times over the last 5 days that I want to talk about now is and I don't remember the phrase, but when somebody's been through trauma that they don't make decisions that support the ecosystem, and I think of that in a way of like, the food choices we make in our body are our closest ecosystem that we live in, and I'm wondering, if you can tie that all together as far as like
Absolutely.
how trauma and not engaging in that self-care or not having those things resolved then affect the care one gives to themselves.
Absolutely, Carol. Yeah, I'd be glad to. It's an interesting notion, the idea that if you define trauma like Peter Levine describes it, as the subjective experience of being overwhelmed. So it's that being overwhelmed is very interesting because there's another person named Donald Vanderhart who frequently talks about dissociation being at the center of all trauma. And so an interesting seems to happen when people are overwhelmed consistently. We know a number of physiological things happen, like elevated cortisol levels, and then people can become immune to their own cortisol, which helps them, survive, threatening and scary things.
So we were talking about that cortisol resistance, similar to insulin resistance. You can develop a cortisol resistance as well from constant stress. So
exactly, the very things that tell you, hey, you know what, you have an alarm going off. You're in danger. Well, you live in so much danger, and you keep getting overwhelmed. Sooner or later, all kinds of fascinating things happen, right? And one of them, a common one, is that the person may learn to dissociate or kind of leave the body. Well, guess what? If people get accustomed or habituated to leaving their bodies, they do a lot of not very mindful things. They might, adverse childhood experiences studies have shown us people are much more risk to develop any number of unhealthy habits, right? Or be at risk to any number of from an integrated standpoint, manifest as what we call mental conditions, but also what we call physiological conditions as well. And so that dissociation is a big thing. Well, not surprisingly, when people are dissociating, they're more likely to, if they've not already gotten addicted to something that may have used to kind of cope with their stressors, they might continue to do things like smoking or just pick up any food that's fast, regardless of how processed it is. In fact, they're less likely to be mindful about how it's affecting them. They're less mindful about how their bodies are reacting to it. They're less mindful about how their body's shape is changing or how much stamina they have or the condition of their skin. And so, sure enough, and as they do that, as they're, you may argue, unconsciously supporting a whole way of how they get their needs met, all those ways, including how they rely on maybe a food system that's not healthy. That's who's getting their money. So we think about all those things you've talked about, and we've talked over the last 5 days about, look at all these ways that the people who make the food, for example, may take shortcuts and how they prepare it. Well, these folks are going to go for what's inexpensive, and they're going to go for what's fast, And so they may not necessarily be taking things that are even maintaining, coping with all these stressors, much less getting less dissociative, being okay with their bodies, being in the present, being more mindful. So it becomes kind of a vicious cycle. And so the implication is, with this rather long-winded way of saying it, is that they're maybe unconsciously supporting an entire way of preparing or making food for people, for example, that actually hurts the sustainability of our ecosystem.
Yeah.
Because we're not cultivating things that are balanced.
I think it's really, really fascinating because, a lot of people are really successful on a ketogenic diet. It's a radical change for most people from what they're used to eating. However, there's a certain subset that really struggle with, they've had some experience, for example, with following a ketogenic diet or reducing carbs, and they know they feel better. However, they keep falling back into these, a lot of them say, emotional eating or stress eating. And for them, they feel really defeated and they feel like they're, a failure. There's something wrong with them. It's like, why do I keep going back to these old habits when something really stressful happens? And my sense is, and perhaps you think the same, is that they probably have some significant traumas that have created these habits for them that have, they've helped them survive in the past. They've filled a role, and there's a reason they've been doing that. It's not because they're a bad person or they have terrible willpower, but they've done the best they can for as long as they can. But they often get to the point where they're really ready to make a change. What do you think about that?
I think I couldn't agree with you more. And what I find is that regardless of whatever it was that the person used to cope with uncomfortable feelings,
Mm-hmm.
for that reason they kind of get used to dissociating and leaving their bodies or not being fully present, because that's where a lot of pain is. And so all the different addictions, so to speak, that they develop, they wind up maybe at greater risk to going to when they're going. In fact, we can see it as they're going through the stress. If it's interesting, isn't it? As they're going through the stress of letting go of old pains and old memories and old distressing things, there's a certain degree, we find this with adults particularly, that it feels kind of weird to be shedding those things. And so sometimes they're at greater risk because the therapy itself is kind of like, for a lot of folks, it's kind of like removing a splinter. It doesn't feel very good as you're taking it out. So it can be pretty stressful, and they're at great risk to hold on to some old ways to help them kind of cope with these changes.
Yeah.
And so they're at much greater risk for doing that, I find. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Well, and I love, this is a perfect segue into the next thing I want to talk about that you're so excited about. This, for a lot of people, the thought, they know they may have these challenges or struggle with emotional eating or stress eating. However, the thought of going to therapy is more daunting than having to live with the emotional eating, because for a lot of people, the thought is, and maybe perhaps the experience they've had in the past with some counseling, is that they've got to relive all those traumatic memories, and it was hard enough going through them the first time. Who would want to have to relive them in somebody's office that you're paying? And so I've had that experience myself. I go in and talk to somebody, and you talk through some stuff, and you leave crying and feeling emotionally wrung out, and it's no fun. And so that's a big reason I think that a lot of people are maybe not put off by it, but just afraid to go to counseling in general. And so this leads into something that's really exciting, this EMDR, eye movement desensitization.
And reprocessing.
Reprocessing, okay, that's it. So tell us, why is that so exciting for people that have gone through trauma, especially the ones that are afraid of going to counseling in the first place?
What's wonderful, a lot of folks will say they've had experiences like you described, where they kind of feel like they're kind of getting to go in and they're going to have everything analyzed, and there's going to be a need to kind of deconstruct it somehow and look at all the different pieces of it and analyze, and what are the antecedents, and what were you thinking, and what were you feeling, and what kind of consequences did that result in. And or maybe they just have somebody where they have this sense that they're going to lie on a couch and they're just going to free associate for years, and that it may be a really long and hurtful process. And so what I found being interested in hypnosis, kind of in the last 5 or 6 years or so, maybe just before we started working together back in 2011, I was taking an interest in the work of Francine Shapiro, and she back in the late 80s had kind of discovered in a most interesting way that by having her eyes move back and forth, she noticed that her own anxiety was going down. She was going through a really trying period in her own life, she stumbled upon this with noticing that eye movements, kind of like what you do when you have REM sleep while you're sleeping, seems to be, we have a number of hypotheses about it, seems to be related to kind of internally resolving things. What I love about EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, parenthetically, even Francine Shapiro says, I'd probably name it something different because it's such a mouthful, because it really is kind of a reprocessing therapy, or a chance to let go or kind of adequately process. So her theory says, the main piece of it says, the reason we're getting triggered is because we haven't adequately processed and connected ourselves with our own internal resources adequately. We haven't adequately done that. And so the therapy essentially says, I'm going to ask you to have kind of an awareness of being here, being safe. Now I'm going to ask you, as if we were on a train, to sample, look through the window and sample those experiences. One by one, we'll work on them. Take those, right? One at a time, we'll take them, and we'll give you a chance to process it in a safe place by way of, in this case, by way of eye movement, but we're not limited to that, by way of bilateral stimulation. And we have found that by doing that, it helps you access your own internal resources. And the desensitization part is that it's no longer dominating your thinking, your feeling, and your behaving, and what you feel in your body. We help you get desensitized with it. So you don't become a robot or anything. If anything, you've kind of released what has so much colored your present life and had you so vulnerable to be kind of unconsciously reacting and being triggered, and we believe you're at much more risk to do anything, a number of things that are unhealthy, like settle for unhealthy relationships, allow yourself to be vulnerable, and to unconsciously reenact some of the things where you've suffered before. So anyway, in short, that's the idea of you haven't adequately processed it, but you don't have to relive it. So that is a beautiful piece of it. It's not like exposure therapy that way, where the idea is, well, we're going to have you expose, maybe even flood you to things that remind you of those painful things. And our goal is what we call a dual awareness. You're here, you're safe. Sample just enough of those experiences, your associations with them, to adequately process in a safe way that you're desensitized from them. They're no longer dominate you in the present, and it has this kind of beautiful cumulative effect as we do it.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about how it has very hypnotic qualities to it. So the two of them together marry very well. And
very much so. In fact, one phase of EMDR involves us helping prepare you and build some resources, right? And so I use myself, and different practitioners do a lot of different things. They might use yoga, they might use different forms of meditation, they might use all kinds of imagery in Tai Chi and Qigong and all kinds of beautiful things. There's really no limit as you get early into the work with people to kind of build the resources before you go about the business of helping them release what happened to them. Notice that kind of trauma-informed care perspective of, I'm more interested in what happened to you and less interested in thinking solely about diagnosis and what's lacking. Yeah. So very much so, using hypnosis to kind of help people, as Erickson might, start to discover, elicit your strengths and internal resources.
Yeah, and like the examples you're giving of yoga and Tai Chi and massage or whatever, those are things that I work with in my 90-day program. So you use them. You use the phrase building internal resources. I talk about building self-care strategies. So it's the same thing, and they fit really well together. And I want to go back to kind of in the middle, you talked about a trigger. And so just to be a little more clear about what that is for people, how you might see it in your everyday life, the people that are listening or watching that do struggle with that emotional or stress eating, where you're going along, things are going really well, and you've stayed on plan for a while, and then all of a sudden something happens. So that can be the trigger. It could be something that's extremely stressful. It could be something that's really happy. It could be neutral. It could be negative or positive. It could be anything. And all of a sudden you find you've got an extreme craving for some food that's off plan, or maybe it's a food you haven't thought about in a while, or maybe it's a food that was your favorite food. Who knows what it was, but that's kind of the idea of a trigger. Something happens that triggers something in the brain to remember something from the past. And so this is something that both hypnosis and EMDR can help those associations. And a lot of times they aren't even conscious, right? Like you just might know that you're eating this food that you don't want to eat, and you don't even know why. There can be a lot of those that are those subconscious, like trigger things that maybe relate to something early on that was a trauma. And so this is a way that you can actually heal that without even knowing what it was.
That's one of the beauties, and there again is one of the lovely parts of this kind of therapy, whether it's some form of clinical hypnosis or EMDR or a number of therapies very similar, with the beautiful notion being, well, you may not understand the why, or you may not have insight into it. You may not even remember.
Yeah.
Maybe you start to as we're doing the work, but even that is not necessary. It's not necessary to even have insight about it. And so, yeah, very much so. And it has that unconscious quality. So, yeah, you go through something stressful, or you start having these really powerful feelings. You know, if maybe something's not okay, or maybe you're in danger, or you're anticipating something. And before you know it, you're engaged in some sort of eating behavior, sticking something in you, and you're kind of dissociated as you're doing it.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe that was an old way of coping, but yeah, now here you are. Yeah, it can happen. You can even while doing therapy, it can happen, and especially if you're not doing some form of healing, we suspect you're at great risk to be just kind of subjected to that, kind of like this, kind of like an impulse to go to. Whereas we're hoping, even with this kind of therapy, where we're not analyzing everything, and you don't have the therapist, well, you know, I think it can mean this, and if you ever consider that, and we ought to change some of your beliefs about these things.
Let me add that diagnosis.
And we need to just change your belief. You got faulty thinking, and so one of the beauties of these kind of therapies that I really find very lovely, it has that permissive quality, and by that meaning, I'm really more interested in discovering and augmenting and strengthening your strengths and your resources, as opposed to focusing all the time on what's wrong with you.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, you don't have to, there's nothing wrong with the way you think.
Right.
Let's help you access your internal resources, your abilities to take care of yourself here.
One of the ways, for example, in the EMDR, we can tell that there are two beautiful things that stand out about that. Two of the ways that we can tell the person's really benefiting from EMDR, for example, is even as we're not focusing on what's wrong with your thinking, and I'm not trying to convince you there's something wrong or distorted about your thinking, as we do the therapy, which has so much to do with honoring and respecting all the things that you think and you feel and you sense in your bodies, or in your body, as we do that with the therapy, we're desensitizing. Notice they just kind of like second nature go to some sort of desensitization, bilateral stimulate. That's one of the things we use in the therapy. People's thinking, as evidenced by how they talk about themselves, does change. So they start to say more positive things about themselves without me telling them, you ought to be thinking differently. We're going to handle it. There's none of that going on. And their negative self-talk is reducing, it's going down. In fact, they start to treat themselves better. They start to set better boundaries for themselves and set limits. They begin to be more aware. Their senses are online. They're opening channels to all of their senses. Colors become more vivid. Sounds become more aware of what's in their environment. And they're not surprisingly, their smell, their taste, their sense of what their body tells them. So it's not uncommon for people who talk, and you can tell I'm getting all excited about it, they'll talk about the power, the wisdom of the body. And it becomes more and more difficult as they do the work. Of course, we do this in clinical hypnosis as well. We actually may suggest it can become more and more difficult for you to do things, put things in the body that don't nurture it, to do things that hurt the body's functioning, that question the body's integrity. And so I get goosebumps just talking about it because I see that transformation in people.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
It's going to be really powerful.
Yeah.
So on the average then, how many sessions does it take somebody to go through this process? I mean, of course, it's going to vary on how complex things are, but what kind of range do you see?
Well, there are a number of factors, right? Just like you said. So the age of the person becomes a factor. We find that the younger the folks are, the more readily.
And little kids are great with both hypnosis and EMDR.
They are. They're amazing. They just go right along with it, and they make beautiful connections, and they let go of things that are not theirs. They're kind of weighing them down. Very much true in both, and I find those to be the case. With adults, what can happen is just like they might be kind of habituated to eating a lot of carbohydrates, for example. They're habituated to that, even though they know they're not going to feel good. So, well, they may or may not know. It's a whole other piece of the equation. But they kind of, it's funny, is we get accustomed to a lot of things we get accustomed to that are not necessarily feeling very good. We kind of interestingly develop a sense of self or a personality. It's interesting to where we start to believe that's how we are. Just like my family was thinking, oh, well, that's our genetics. You know, for example, we have high triglycerides and high cholesterol.
Nice callback.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. But also, people kind of develop a sense that, well, you know, this is how I am. This is my personality. You know, I don't have good relationships with people, or I'm not an assertive person, or I'm not an extrovert, or I'm not creative, or I'm not the kind of person who thinks out of the box, or I would never really go. I'm not an adventurer. You know, I'm not an explorer. And so they come to believe these things, and they're all, to a great extent, based on, or they say things like, you know, well, I come from 7 generations of smokers, or my family was always kind of type A personalities, or we're hard workers, or we're heavy drinkers and heavy partiers. So they develop a sense of who they are based on all this suffering. And so those are big factors. So that can mean that if it's just like you get a sense that the person's suffering is maybe related, maybe otherwise have done pretty well in life, you know, had good attachment, meaning, you know, good support and family and people sending the message, like in the movie The Help, you know, you is smart, you is important, you know, you're worthy of being loved. Well, say they have something really bad happen to them, you know, a really bad car accident, you know, or some sort of natural disaster, a terrible storm, and it's overwhelming. Well, then in a case like that, it might be pretty quick. Now, say we're talking about a person who has a number of really self-destructive patterns, and may not even remember that the person was subjected to a lot of really hurtful things really young, then, you know, then it might be a lot longer. So you might be talking about a matter of maybe just a few sessions with children, maybe 4, 5, 6 sessions, perhaps, to give you an example. And then with an adult who presents a real complex trauma history, where we may identify all kinds of really painful things that may have lasted for years. In the case of maybe somebody who had grown up in a family where there may have been a lot of sexual abuse that may have lasted for years, then it may take us 30, 40, 50, 60 or more sessions but even there, how about that? Even when there's something like that, it can make such a big difference in the person's life.
Anything else that you're passionate about that you want to share with us?
Very much. Well, thank you. I appreciate you asking me that, Carole. I happen to think that I had the advantage of having grown up in a lot of different ways, having been exposed to many different cultures and contact. I kind of grew up in kind of I guess you could say it was a pilot program that over the years evolved, and kind of a bilingual program. So I kind of grew up with English and Spanish. Most of my instructors were from Argentina. I grew up in Atlanta. And a lot of people say, wow, that's kind of surprising, you know, in the Deep South, growing up in the 60s and 70s, you know, that you got exposed to that. So I really feel very blessed and very fortunate. I dare say that those kinds of experiences, those cultural experiences, and I think this can be true for all of us, of an opportunity to learn so many different things and to recognize that it's a wonderful opportunity to be exposed from people from many different places. These have had huge impacts on me, and I keep getting reminded what a great attitude, and I've been feeling it over the last 5 days of being reminded of all the different ways that, you know, if you just give yourself permission to be open to new ways of doing things, it's really good for your central nervous system, it's good for your brain, it's good for your organism. And so, yeah, that really stands out for me. I get reminded of the beauty of that. Here I am, you know, I'll be 55 in July, and I'm kind of, in some certain really interesting ways, I'm feeling like I'm learning a number of new things for the first time. And so letting myself be open to letting other people play a role of being the hypnotist with me, you know, and teaching me lessons. It's very humbling, and yeah, I feel very passionate about that. You know, learning all the time, learning new things.
Yeah,
absolutely. And this ketogenic business has been part of that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you've been able to be on this journey with me for the last little segment that I've been here in Phoenix. I've had a fantastic time, and I've learned a lot myself, and it's been really fun to share all that with you. And I'm really grateful that you've sat down with me here and chatted with me about your own health transformation, taking your own health into your hands, and then also sharing the things that you're really passionate about. Thank you for being here, Randy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure.
All right. Well, that's all for now. We'll see you soon. Bye.